having a broader aerobic base is always going to be advantageous. So if you're hitting high output work in the gym and you're concerned about how to spend that extra 30, 45 minutes that you might have and you want to do a little bit of running, I would have you go and do zone two work. And then, like to your point, build that out across 2 sessions, 3 sessions, or more. Team, welcome to an episode with just Drew and Alex. Today, instead of banter, we're going to address some questions that folks have
Yeah,
asked, or a question.
I think we'll address one question. We'll save
One
others
question.
for other days. And this is possibly a teaser for a future episode, maybe.
Hmm.
We'll see if it gets its whole own episode. We'll explain that after we talk about it. You guys probably seen the news. New Ranger School fitness test, previously called RPA 2.0. I don't know if they're still using that name. Who knows? But there is a new standard fitness test for Rangers. So gone are the days of push-ups, sit-ups, run. We're trying to move away from that since it was based on the APFT to something more. And I'm going to use terminology used by leaders at Fort Benning on this one. They said it was more because the Army is moving towards functional fitness. I don't know what functional fitness means necessarily. I don't think that's a well-defined term, but I have thought about this test a little bit. Drew has not. Drew is like basically looking at it for the first time right now.
Hmm.
So I'm curious, Drew, as somebody who has not been in the weeds of this stuff, but is a strength and conditioning coach, has lots of thoughts on assessments. What do you think?
Well, I just realized that there's a 4 mile run and 6 chin ups after that first
Correct.
slide. So I'll just, I mean, well, you can go to the Mops and Mo's Instagram to see the full test, but it's an 800-meter run, 30 push-ups, 100-meter sprint, some sandbag lifts onto a 68-inch platform, 50-meter farmer's carry, 25-meter high crawl, 25-meter 3 to 5 second rush, then an 800-meter run, and then you change your clothes and you go for a 4 mile run.
Correct.
And then when you get back just for funsies, you do 6 chin ups.
Correct.
The chin ups at the end seems kind of like an afterthought. I guess you'd be super fatigued at that point. So maybe that's kind of interesting.
They've always had chin ups in this thing. They used to call them pull ups for some reason. They've
Yeah.
always been chin ups, though. They've always been palms towards you
Palms
grip.
towards you.
So they just retained that, but made it a separate thing rather than during it. My best guess for what's going on there is that the logistics of running people through pull up bars and like grading the pull ups well just didn't work in the middle of like a hectic event. So they kept it separate. That's my only logic for why that would be. Actually, now's a good time to explain why we think this might lead to a whole other episode. We are in contact with Ranger Training
Yes.
Brigade. We're going to try and get somebody on to talk through why they decided to change the test, what logic went into the new test, all that kind of stuff. So you may hear much more about this in the near future if they agree to come on. We'll see.
I like the fact that this looks more functional, which I realize
Mhm.
is a buzzword. My first like blush at this is that you're kind of testing the same thing over and over and over again, which is like short power
Sure.
output, explosive stuff. I mean, none of these events is really deviating too far from the middle of the spectrum. I could understand why you wouldn't really have an absolute strength component in this, especially if the whole thing's timed from start to finish, because then you're just asking for a disaster.
Well, I'll riff on what you're saying there. Some of the comments on the post when I put it up talk about like this should replace the ACFT and thoughts along those lines. Whether an assessment is good depends on what the purpose of the assessment is.
Right.
And this has always been a go, no go. Do you get to enter the course assessment? We are screening to make sure you are fit enough to participate in this course safely. And
From
I
that
think for those
perspective, it
purposes,
makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, I think this is reasonable.
The run at the end, like I would have put the chin ups in the thing, but I could understand the argument for fatigued pulling, especially with like a lot of climbing involved in ranger school. But there's a comment on here about adding a ruck. That I would almost be in favor of a ruck instead of the 4 mile
I mean,
run.
they still have to do plenty
I
of
know they
rucking
do
at
plenty
range.
of rucking,
Cool.
but like you're testing running a lot here.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
technically you're doing the
It's a cool
same amount of
test.
total running as you had before because it used to be a
Yeah.
5 mile. 40-minute standard.
Hmm.
Now it's a
4 mile,
same
32
pace,
minute.
but 4 miles, and then the other mile is split up into the 800s of this thing.
That's a good point. I didn't realize that.
So you're
Okay.
you're covering the same amount of running as you were before. The
Sure.
real point here, I think, you pointed out that there's no maximal strength test here. None of these even require that high a percentage of what your absolute strength should be.
Hmm.
So ultimately, and like if you do the math on this a little bit, say you do the 800s at an 8-minute mile pace, that leaves you 6 minutes for everything else. 30 dead stop push-ups, say that takes you 60 to 90 seconds. 100-meter sprint, not that long, even though it's not going to be a sprint. I don't know why we're
I
calling it
mean,
a
you're
sprint in this
cruising.
situation.
6 minutes left to do all that. You're
It's
fucking.
I don't think it's honestly that much to
I'm
accomplish in
having a
six
hard
minutes.
time and like it's hard to sort of visualize. I'm curious to see how class, what is it, 0625?
Yeah. And I know
Curious
we
how
have
they
some
do.
followers of Mopsimos that are going to be in that class.
Let
And
us know.
I will probably demo this event myself. Drew, I bet you see this thing popping up all over the place on Fort Bragg. So jump in sometime. Tell us how you do.
PC and the pups commented at Dave Castro, if only there was a training methodology that could prepare soldiers for this test.
I have had to practice my posting and ghosting skills on some of these comments.
That's a yeah, don't that's yeah, bless his heart. Okay, but so I should probably add for people listening, we're gonna try and do more of this quick FAQ stuff
Yeah.
in episode introductions forthcoming. So if you guys do have questions you want answered, send them in and we will answer them.
Now on to the primary topic of the episode.
Now on to running. So
Well,
for
first off, a
those,
question.
please.
You titled this episode Endurance 101.
I thought you titled the episode
You
Endurance
titled
101.
it. I
Did I?
copied your plan for this episode into a notes document. Sorry for being the one who organizes things here.
Oh, I
But you
thought that
said,
was your title. I was going to ask you why you titled it that.
well, I don't know. Are we talking about running or are we talking about endurance? Do we want to keep this to running?
Sure.
Okay, that
Well,
simplifies
for me
things.
specifically, and that entire monologue we just had might be irrelevant because by the time it comes out, we may have changed the title. So,
Maybe.
for folks who are unawares, and this will be in the show notes, Alex, it'll be in the show notes. I published a blog post on our website on March 13th of this year.
Which had endurance in the title, not running.
That's correct. Sorry. But it was bottoms up versus top down endurance training. And I think the reason I did that is because it works with all kinds of modalities, not just running. But the genesis for this blog post was a conversation, I think, around like how to improve for your ACFT or any kind of PT test. And I'm painting with broad strokes intentionally with the post, but the idea is that most people fall into one of two archetypes. You are either more of a strength power type athlete, in which case you like some heavy lifting, you like explosive stuff. You're very good at producing power for short durations, but to get better at endurance, you don't have like the requisite capability to go long. And then on the other side of the equation is the archetypical skinny endurance guy who can go really long at like a slow-ish pace, but when you ask them to produce power or generate high outputs, they are more or less incapable of doing that. And so the blog post was a little bit of stream of conscious, but it was how I think about training both sides of that spectrum and explaining a little bit about top down versus bottom up, which we can get into, and then the training process for each one of those archetypes. So I'll preface this at the beginning because who knows where we'll go, but just because you might fall into one of those two does not mean that certain training won't work. It's just that there's probably a better way or a more tailored way based on the type of athlete that you are. So hopefully that was a decent intro.
Well, I'll also clarify too. We tend to treat these things as one or the other when they're
Right.
almost always a spectrum. You are probably not at the extreme end of the spectrum. I mean, Drew, I'm sure we've both met people that are at the extreme ends of the spectrum. They are out there,
Yeah.
they're running around.
They're usually in the Olympics.
Yeah, I mean, even in the military, they're running around, right? Like
Yeah,
you
that's
meet
fair.
people who can like put on muscle super easily, but as a result, they can unfortunately put on fat super easily. So like staying lean is tough and endurance training is hard, but they can get really strong really fast. And then you meet people who have a super hard time gaining mass, but they can cover distance like crazy and it's
Hmm.
awesome. But I think the vast majority of people, even if they're like self-identifying as one end of the spectrum because they like that thing better, are probably somewhere in the middle and could achieve a lot more in whatever their weakness is.
Well, it's funny you say that because when I published this, I had a couple of different people reach out to me. Oh, like I'm for sure this, I'm for sure that. It's like, which again, maybe, but the point of the article and the conversation today is less, hey, I'm a strength power person. That's not an excuse as to why you can't get better. It's more, okay, that serves as our starting point. And then here's a map you can use to hopefully get to where you're
Yeah.
trying to go, which in this case was kind of a 2 mile ACFT thing.
And to cage what we're about to talk about, this is something I'll try to return to as we have this conversation. What Drew has set up here implies a degree of individualization. And that's easy to do when you're training on your own or if you're a coach training an individual person. But since we're speaking to a largely tactical, largely military audience, many of you are either training people in group settings or participating in group training settings. Um, One of the things we struggle with in every tactical setting is that individualization matters in training, like knowing what people's strengths and weaknesses are, knowing what dose is appropriate for them, all this kind of stuff. But we inevitably have to produce training events that work in this industrial scale
Hmm.
type of situation. And I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where the military really does individualized training, but I think we can individualize within our training sessions to some degree. So
Hmm.
we'll try and bring that up as we go. And like, how could you have two people training different ways during the same session, or should you split up groups based on this? Things like that.
Right.
I was just thinking about that because dinner last week met up with a buddy that I was in the same infantry battalion with years ago, and he had like a comment slash question in there where he was like, I don't know what's going on, but like I work out like half as much as I did when I was active duty, and I feel better, and I
Oh,
feel like I
I'm
can
right there.
perform.
I'm right there with them.
And now there's pieces to that puzzle, right? Like I don't know if we like went and did a ruck march right now, how he'd do because certain things you just need volume to do. But I believe him that like he's performing pretty well. And I same with me, right? I train less than I did most of the time I was on active duty. But when you can individualize, you can get more out of the training that you do. You can be more efficient with the time you put into training. And I think that's part of the goal of what we're discussing here is how can you put together some training that will maximize the results you get without necessarily adding on tons and tons and tons of volume.
Yes. Yeah. No, I would agree with that.
Okay. Where you want to go first?
Um, well, okay, so we talked a little bit about top down versus bottom up, and you'll probably hear me reference the blog post more than once in this conversation. But just to give folks a visual, in the actual post, I used a triangle. But just picture any event. Like I said, in this case, it's 2 miles. It could be a 1 mile run. It could be a 10K. It could be a 50K. But the idea there is that you have, if the event is in the middle, you can come at it from two directions. You can start at a pace that is slower and at a distance that is further and work your way down. Or you can start on the other end, which
Work
would
your way
be at a,
up based on your diagram.
yeah, sorry, work your way up, broad based, more narrow. Or you can work the other end, which would be faster pace, shorter distances. And the argument or the point being made here is that for a traditional kind of strength power type person who does not generate, or sorry, who is not good at sustaining output, working at a faster pace and at shorter distances is going to be more advantageous. Whereas for somebody who is very good at sustaining a relatively slow pace, coming at it from the other end is going to be more advantageous. And another thing you'll hear us talk about throughout this whole thing is that just because you're starting at one side or the other doesn't mean that you don't include components of the opposite end of the spectrum, which might sound a little bit confusing as I'm talking about it. But even if I have somebody who has never run before and has been a power lifter their whole life, the preponderance of their endurance work is going to be short, fast at the beginning, but we're still going to get touches on endurance. And for that person, endurance might be 20 minutes, but we're still building capacity and volume as we're targeting the speed power, if that
So
makes
I'm
sense.
curious. I have a question for you at this point.
Please.
You used the word advantageous. Do you
Yes.
mean advantageous in the sense that they're going to adapt better to that training and see faster improvements? Or do you mean advantageous in the sense that we're not trying to force them out of their comfort zone immediately? And this
Both.
is training that they might like be more
Both.
comfortable with early on and able to progress from there.
I think it's both. I think, and I made this case, maybe it was on the Uphill Athlete podcast that I was on, but in my experience, when you are introducing, because typically strength power types are folks that have spent a lot of time in the gym. Maybe they've played a field sport at some point, but they prefer to generate power, lift weights, be explosive. And when you introduce somebody like that to endurance training, they don't necessarily want to do it because it is different from what they're used to. And so there is an element to that comment about being advantageous to where we are kind of trickling the dosage and getting them comfortable with the idea of running in this case. But I think too, the other end of that is that it is advantageous from like a physiological standpoint for a number of reasons. I mean, one that comes to mind would be if I take somebody who does not have a lot of volume built into their musculature, into their tendons, into their, whatever, and I send them out on a 10-mile run, they might suffer through that and complete it, but it's not like they're going to feel it the next day. I think that that's especially popular in the military setting. So yeah, the short answer would be both,
Okay,
if
deal.
that's not a cop out. So do you want to go top down or do you want to go bottom up? Where do you want to start?
You referring to the training methodology or the notes document?
Let's start with the let's start with the speed power guys. Unless you want to discuss the things that you wanted to address, the zone two and all that.
No, go for it because I think building out the concept is going to be helpful to people because the things
Sure.
I have listed that I think we need to touch on don't necessarily fall into one or the other.
No, that's fair. Okay, so the first thing, referencing what I was mentioning earlier about getting texts from a bunch of people, like you can kind of self-identify a little bit. You might be wrong, but you're not going to hurt anybody. As a rule of thumb, and some people might knock me for this, that's fine. But as a rule of thumb, if you're somebody who likes to get in the gym, who likes to lift heavy, who prefers short output type stuff, and most of these people know who they are. If you were to come to me and ask for coaching, in my brain, I would be classifying you as sort of a speed power type person. And so if you were telling me that you wanted to complete a 5K or you wanted to get better at your 2-mile run, I would be thinking about the top down. So basically going short and fast and then building volume over time. So the quick little rule of thumb on that one is that you do your speed stuff first as you're introducing this athlete to endurance training, and then you add in your endurance or your longer efforts later on. So just again, kind of looking directly at the blog post where we were talking about what a speed power athlete truly is. They've spent more time developing strength, explosiveness, speed. Like I mentioned, they typically come from a gym-based background, this could be a track athlete, but somebody who prefers sprints and shorter distance stuff. I mean, that's kind of the same thing as lifting weights in some sense. The other thing, and again, kind of a rule of thumb here, but you can kind of identify these athletes because they do tend to be bigger. They do tend to carry a little bit more muscle. They tend to carry a little bit more muscle tension. And not to like get too nerdy here, but I'll just do a quick shout out to Evan Pycon. And I've done this before, but when you take these types of athletes, what's really interesting is when you look at oxygenation of the muscle, which nobody should be looking at that except nerds like me. You will see these athletes, these kind of muscle bound strength power athletes, if you put them on just a long, slow, easy run, typically because they create so much tension, that's actually a low oxygen. Like it's the same for those athletes as like lifting heavy weight, creating a lot of muscle tension. So it's interesting because it goes to that question of like the advantageous piece. In some cases, if you take a strength power type athlete and you put them on what you think is a traditional long, slow, easy run, physiologically, you may actually be doing more, and I hate that I'm going to use this word, but you might be doing more of a quote unquote anaerobic thing. So it again just kind of goes to show that it might make sense to hit your speed work first and then work in endurance later.
Should we take a second to explain the difference between internal and external load? Because you're talking around that topic a
Sure.
little bit and it seems worthwhile.
Haven't we? We've touched on that before, haven't we?
We have, but I don't like to assume that people have listened to every
Sure. Yeah, yeah,
episode.
yeah. Go for it.
It had to have been a long time ago if we talked about it. But in a simplified sense, if two soldiers go for like a 4 mile run during PT together, the external load is the same. Like if they're running
Yes.
together, same amount of time, same amount of distance, external load is the same objectively. But internal load is about the stress experienced by the person. And that might be completely different. And it's
Right.
easy to understand with lifting. If I take a strong guy and make him squat 200 pounds, and I take a guy who's never squatted before and make him squat 200 pounds, they're going to experience the same weight very differently in terms of the amount of stress it causes their body. People don't think about that as much on running, but what Drew is describing here is that what's going on inside two different people's bodies performing the same event, even if it's the same distance at the same pace, it's still going to be physiologically different. And it might even be very psychologically different. And that plays in as well.
Mhm.
And so, an understanding here, like this is what we're essentially trying to do is calibrate the internal load appropriately for the athlete rather than focusing on that external load.
Correct. And to your point, just to really quickly touch on the other end, the endurance
Mm-hmm.
stamina athlete. Again, kind of repeating myself a little bit here, but these are folks that have spent a lot of time building up their aerobic base. So the idea of going out on a long, slow run is not foreign to them. And they, in some cases, almost prefer that. Actually, I would say they definitely prefer that. But if you put them in the gym and ask them to lift weights, or a funny example that's kind of often used is if you take Eliud Kipchoge, who ran the sub 2 hour marathon, and you ask him to jump, he doesn't jump very high. He doesn't generate a lot of power. It's not really his thing. Same with these sort of endurance stamina guys. So because they favor those longer efforts, they don't like to, or they aren't great at generating speed. We start on the other end of the spectrum. So in the triangle example, you start at the broad base of the triangle and then you work your way up, which we'll get into here in a second. Have we left stones unturned?
I mean, this is your part of the episode. I don't know if we missed any stones.
Perfect. So we'll talk training really quickly. And again, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of how deep you want to go into endurance training philosophy and different approaches and all that sort of stuff. So this is one corner of a very big um, piece of the strength and conditioning pie. So for the top down guys, which again is the speed endurance guys, the guy, or sorry, the speed power guys, the ones that we want to hit speed first and then endurance later. If I'm thinking of like a week of training, or, in this case in the blog, I used 3 days of training, the majority of those training sessions are going to be more speed based or speed endurance based. And what I mean by that is shorter intervals. So it could be as short as 50 yards, 100 yards. I mean, when I'm thinking intervals for this type of population, 400 meters can be long for some of those folks, but hopefully you get the idea. We're doing shorter intervals. We might have longer rest periods because again, we're prioritizing the speed and the power component of this. But as I mentioned, we still want to leave room for endurance, which for this population, endurance might be 30 minutes, might be 20 minutes. And at the very extreme ends of the spectrum, it might even be non-impact. I might have them on a bike or a rower, or if you have a fancy facility, you might be, running in a pool. But the idea there is that we have touches on endurance because it's important, but we bias our training more towards speed power because we're working from the top of the triangle, the peak of the, pyramid down. We're starting them in a place that they prefer to be. And then over time, as we get closer to our event, that short duration, high power output stuff starts to transform into longer duration intervals. Maybe the endurance day becomes a little bit longer. We're building volume. They're becoming more comfortable with moving over distance. And then we get to that point on race day or event day or what have you, where we have successfully built speed and then we've converted it to endurance. And then we arrive where we want to be, capable of sustaining the pace that we want to sustain for the distance that we need to sustain it for. Did all that make sense?
I'm worried that we've strayed into content that works better on a blog than it does on a podcast. But yes, I think it made sense.
Well, good, luckily for you and all those listening, it's on a blog. So I've spelled all this out on the blog. I have, like I said, I have the training broken down the week. You guys can see what it looks like. I kind of glossed over it here as I'm speaking to it, but there's even some commentary on how you would manipulate rest intervals for these types of folks. But the take home point for this type of athlete, and I would probably think that a lot of people listening to this are probably this type of athlete. But if, say, you want to improve your 2 mile run time, you would bias your training towards shorter, faster intervals, going faster than your goal 2 mile pace. And then as you get closer to your event, you would draw that distance out. So you're sustaining that pace for longer. And that's kind of putting a bow on the strength power athletes, so to speak.
Okay.
Now, let's go the other way. Let's go bottom up. So these guys, endurance first, speed later. The other guys were speed first, endurance later. These guys are
Before Drew
endurance
gets
first.
too deep into this one, this
Yep.
approach is probably the one that's more typically applied to more
Yes.
people,
Mhm.
building volume first and then approaching intensity later. I think that's somewhat typical. So this shouldn't be as
Yeah, this
revolutionary.
is, and I would think that I could be wrong here, but if you dive into any standard endurance training textbook, they're probably coming at it more from this perspective. Uh, the the biggest thing I could emphasize for this type of athlete is that when we are adding speed, we are also thinking more clinically about resistance training because again, these folks do not generate speed and or power very well. So in addition to working on turnover of your feet, i.e. fast intervals, you're also thinking about lifting weights because you have to create all the neuromuscular components that have to do with generating speed and power. So when I get to kind of the conversation on what a week of training looks like, you'll notice that there is a conversation in there about resistance training. Whereas with the other athletes, the speed power guys, resistance training is still happening, but it's not as critical because we're working more on the aerobic kind of physiological side of the house. So anyway, for the bottoms up folks, whereas before we were biasing our training more towards speed power and then also keeping a little bit of a touch on endurance, these guys we're biasing endurance a little bit more, but we are having touches of speed power, like I mentioned, with the strength work, with some short sprints. I have worked with folks on the extreme end of this spectrum where the sprint work happens like at the end of a gym session, and maybe it happens on like an assault bike. We're just getting them to work on high output for short periods of time. So that might be one of their training days. The other 2 days might be, in this case, intervals, but longer intervals. So whereas before 400 meters seemed like a long interval, for these guys, we might be doing 1200-meter repeats, mile repeats, where the pace might be slightly faster than our goal pace, but the point is that we're sustaining it for longer because these guys already have the requisite aerobic base. And the other thing is that for these athletes, endurance work comes a lot easier. And so when I say go out for a long run, long in this case doesn't mean 30 minutes, it means 60 minutes or 90 minutes. So we have the ability to accumulate a lot of volume. And then as we work towards our goal, we're adding in intensity. We're basically peaking these guys by increasing the pace, moving faster, shrinking the distances, and then we arrive at, hey, you can produce output or you can produce high output for 2 miles. Because, like I said, in this case, we're thinking about the ACFT. So, to put a bow on these guys, we build endurance first because that's what they prefer, that's what they're good at. And then we layer in speed. We focus on speed as we get closer to a race day. So, that was a little shorter, I think.
That was shorter. I appreciated it.
Maybe. Yeah.
Should we uh should we start hitting the grab bag of
Yeah,
contextual topics we need to deal with?
sure. Let's do it.
All right. This first one has a lot to do with bottom up, I guess. But zone two. If you're talking about endurance, somebody's going to ask about zone two. Should I do it? How important is it? What do we do? I'm gonna
I
let you go
think
off.
I think we've man, we've for sure talked about this before, but where we're at right now, I think when most people say zone two, they what they really mean is just moving slow for a long period of time. Like I don't think a ton of them are actually doing the requisite testing to determine what that actual threshold is. And by the way, I don't necessarily think that you need to. So is the question, who is it appropriate for?
Yeah, I think who is it and isn't it appropriate for? And I'll layer in like at what point in your endurance training do you have to be at for it to even be relevant? Because I think here's I'll just I'll lay
Oh,
in the
I think
conversation
I
here.
see what you're asking.
I think we see a lot of people real worried about zone two whose total weekly cardio volume is like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, just do some higher intensity stuff, like get the most out of the limited time you're going to do. I don't know if there's a perfect threshold for when it starts to be relevant. I've kicked around the idea of like a bare minimum of three 30-minute sessions a week before we need to really waste time having a conversation about polarizing training. Yeah, I think zone two is a fatigue management strategy.
Yeah, I would say if like, and if I understood your example correctly, like if somebody were to come to me and they said, hey, I got like 45 minutes to do endurance work. And so what I've chosen to do is a bunch of intervals because I think working harder is like the answer. My counter argument would be if you're already in the gym lifting for X many days per week, the sprints that you're doing are just repeating the same stressor. I would actually have you go out and spend that 45 minutes doing quote unquote zone two aerobic base building work. I think, and we've made this point before, like maybe not this aggressively. Like there's really no downside to zone two train. Like having a broader aerobic base is always going to be advantageous. So if you're hitting high output work in the gym and you're concerned about how to spend that extra 30, 45 minutes that you might have and you want to do a little bit of running, I would have you go and do zone two work. And then, like to your point, build that out across 2 sessions, 3 sessions, or more.
That's fair. So I don't want to get you in trouble here,
Please
but it
get me in
sounds
trouble.
like you just described a top down type of athlete and the relevance of doing long duration, low intensity work.
Well, it's not getting me in trouble because if you recall, and people will see this on the blog post, I reserved that one day for those guys to build endurance, to do the 30-minute thing. Because
Okay.
again, and this, I'm not going to dive down this rabbit hole. I'll just mention it. Even if I'm working with a strength power guy, if there's extra room and they want to train more, hop on a bike and do zone two stuff. I think the examples in the blog post and what we were just talking about have more to do with running, which to me is like a high impact thing where we have to manage stress a little bit more. But if you're just moving slow on a bike and you happen to be a power lifter, like you're still going to get some of the benefit.
Sure. Deal. Okay. Enough on zone two. This is definitely related to that because we indirectly discussed it there for a second. Minimum effective dose. And I
Of
want to
zone
come
two?
at this of endurance training in
Mm.
general. And
Mm.
I want to come at this because there's if you go to the very early posts of Mops and Mo's, back when Alex was at the peak of Mount Stupid, beginning his Dunning-Kruger journey, I posted the training residuals chart that you'll find in all the
Yeah, we've
textbooks.
talked about this.
And I thought about deleting that post. I leave it up as a historical marker.
An
And I
homage to where you
actually just
stood.
last week somebody shared it with as like this is awesome.
Oh,
And
jeez.
I was like, I don't know if it is because I go back and revisit that stuff and that chart is treated as like gospel truth when people
Yeah.
are first learning strength and conditioning stuff. And if you do even the smallest amount of looking into where the evidence for it comes from, you will realize that it's just kind of made up.
Hmm.
Every single one of those depends on the type of athlete, the training status of the athlete, the level they were at when they started detraining. There's just a million factors where it's not going to be even remotely close to that clean. But I think people use it as an excuse sometimes because on that chart at the very top where you have to like train it really frequently to avoid detraining, speed and power kind of stuff. All the way at the bottom where theoretically you don't have to touch it very often, as little as once a month, is aerobic capacity. And I think that leads people to think that they can like leave endurance on the back burner.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's true. Plus,
Yeah,
detraining is totally different than the dose to improve.
I think the residuals thing is like almost exclusively bullshit. Um, for all the reasons you just mentioned. I mean, so many things go into that. I don't know if this is the best way to think about it, but just from a thought experiment standpoint, I kind of cage everything within the context of a week because that's traditionally how we think about training. And so when I think of minimum effective dose, like from an aerobic capacity standpoint, the 3 30-minute sessions you mentioned is kind of a clean ideal. You could probably go lower than that though. And like even if you were getting in like 1 half hour session, like let's say sort of and I would actually put myself in this category just because of the training I'm doing right now, but sort of during the week it's more gym based stuff. And then on the weekend I might go run around the lake, which is 3 miles. But I'm sustaining my aerobic capacity. And so that to me would be kind of a minimum effective dose, like, half hour a week kind of thing. But
Minimum effective dose to improve or minimum effective
well,
dose to
that's
sustain?
exactly to sustain. So to
Yeah.
improve, I think you would want to ratchet that up a little bit and somewhere in that 1 to 3 30-minute sessions a week thing.
Okay.
But again, we're sort of throwing shit on the wall and seeing what sticks. It's going to be different for everybody.
And to be clear, there's a school of thought in the tactical world right now that we need to minimize running
Yeah, I don't
because
agree with
it's
that at
the enemy
all.
and it's going to
Who
hurt
says
people.
that?
A lot of coaches, Drew. Come on.
You
A
guys are all
lot of
wrong.
coaches are under the strong impression that they were hired to introduce powerlifting to the military and eliminate running to the extent possible. And I
Hmm.
don't think that's correct. I think you should bring some structure to the training
Yeah, I think
because
eliminate bad running.
it's not that there's too much running. It's that people do too much that they're unprepared for, too much too soon. They don't
Hmm.
like progress into it. I think we can
Well,
provide structure without fearing running.
I think you actually made this point a while ago. But the hard thing about running and introducing running to a large scale population is that if I take 50 people into a gym, I can't make them all squat 200 pounds. Some people are just incapable of doing that. So very quickly you solve for this scalability piece because people can only lift what they can lift. But with running, you it's not as clear cut. And unfortunately, there's enough margin of error to where you start to see injuries and then you start to see narratives around running being dangerous or whatever. And then you start to see, to your point, like people trying to minimize running. It's not that we need to minimize running, it's just that to cater it to a large group, i.e., what we see with like embedded human performance in the army, it takes a little bit more nuance and creativity so that you don't end up sending 50 people out for the same distance at the same pace. And for half of those people, it's soul destroying. And the other half, they come and work out again later in the day because it wasn't hard enough.
Or the people who think they've solved that problem by switching to ability group runs, where you
Correct.
have, and this routinely happens, where they run the same route. So
Mm.
your fastest runners get done the earliest, and now they're chilling, waiting for other stuff. Your
Yeah.
slowest runners get done the latest. If you measure volume in terms of distance, everybody did the same volume. But if you measure volume in terms of like time on your feet, time spent running, you actually just assigned the least volume to the people who were best prepared for volume and could have
Hmm.
handled more. Yeah, we screwed this one up plenty.
Correct.
Okay. Mm, I'll skip one and we'll come back to it in a second. Pros and cons of cross training, introducing modalities other than running into your endurance routine.
Do you mean like rowers,
Yeah.
skiers, or do you mean like
Mhm.
barbells and weightlifting?
I mean, rowers, like alternate cardio modalities.
I mean, interesting timing because I literally had a conversation today with an athlete about this. Like, I tend to believe, and I kind of just mentioned this a while ago, but alternate modalities, which typically just mean like non-impact
Hmm.
modalities, and for people who want to go further, non-impact basically just means you're not on your feet pounding pavement. So, sitting on a rower, sitting on a bike, a ski erg, swimming. I like those a lot because it allows you to accumulate a lot of additional volume without accumulating a lot of additional fatigue. Unless you suck at like swimming and you drown. I mean, then you're dead. So it self-corrects. But so that would be sort of a pro.
Hmm.
Something that I think a lot of people get mixed up on is that it's not a one-to-one carryover. So if you
Yes.
have if you have like a 10K in 2 months and you hate running, so you decide, oh, well, whatever, I'll just like train on a bike. You will accrue some aerobic benefits, but you will not be as prepared as you could be if you were to also include running for,
For a brief moment of nerdiness here, and this will
please.
include references back to Evan Pycon, who you mentioned before. Aerobic adaptations, largely physiology that we're trying to change.
Mhm.
For your body's processing of oxygen, you're looking at three stages. Like how much oxygen can you pull in, how quickly can you or efficiently can you transport it around your body, and how efficiently can you use it at the working muscle.
Yes.
Those first two stages are kind of activity independent, right? Lung capacity, breathing it in, your alveoli moving it into your bloodstream moving it
Hmm.
around your body. Doesn't really matter whether you're biking, running, swimming, whatever. Those are going to happen the same way. You can get adaptations in those systems. The third one, where it's how efficiently can you
Utilization.
process oxygen at the working muscle, it's relying on a few things: mitochondrial stuff, um, capillarization of the actual muscles being worked. That one is very activity dependent. So, which muscles you use determines which muscles will adapt to that. And therefore, yes, some muscles overlap between biking and running, but not that, like it's not nearly one
Right.
for one. So, obviously, running is going to be best for running. Plus, you have the like neuromuscular efficiency stuff of just like doing the movement and becoming more economical in how you do it that you have to just do the activity for.
And that, friends, was a beautiful description of how energy systems actually work versus the traditional bullshit around anaerobic, aerobic, 0 to 30 seconds, blah, 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 blah. Well
Drew
said.
gets really triggered by traditional energy system stuff. I
Yeah.
still think it might be like a semi-useful framework to help some people
Well, but
structure training,
the framework you just posited was very effective.
but it
And I
doesn't
think,
help very much in determining training prescription unless you just said people shouldn't be looking at muscle oxygenation and you would have to
no,
look at
I know.
that
And I
to
actually just
determine.
had this conversation. I know I said this already, but like at lunch today, because I have some folks at a course that is teaching traditional energy system training, and
Mhm.
we were sort of going back and forth. And I think I will always be willing to accept the fact that, like, unless you're at the cutting edge, the training looks roughly the same, regardless of which energy system model you subscribe to. But the point that we made when we talked to Evan a while back, which I still maintain, is that it's when training breaks down and you have to solve for why. That's when it helps to understand how the physiology actually works, which is kind of what you just explained there. So sure, it doesn't change the training all that much, but when your athlete is failing to adapt, it helps to have a a good understanding of how physiology actually works. But dancing around a
Sure.
rabbit hole there.
Hey, Drew, question for you.
I think, yes, please.
Can you replace volume with intensity?
Can you replace volume with intensity? I don't think so.
I was hoping for a longer answer, but I'll do what I expected you to say. Um, I think an important point, and this circles back. I said a second ago that when we're training endurance, we're looking at largely physiological adaptations. What does that
Mhm.
mean? I'll put it in context. When you're training strength and power, it's more about neurological adaptations than it is about physiological adaptations. Like, yes,
Yes.
you're going to build some muscle and things like that, but it is the neuro control of those muscles that is the most important thing for strength outcomes. So in those situations, for those adaptations, intensity is king because intensity drives the neurological adaptations. For cardio, where we're talking about mitochondria and capillaries, that's more physiological. It's not about motor control as much, although it still plays a role. And for physiological adaptations, you just need exposure to volume.
Hmm.
And so when I was a lieutenant, I used to think you could like, if you just had to cram for it, just do 400s, it'll get you there, whatever. And in like the short term, a lot of studies, we've talked about this problem with fitness studies, is they're looking for maximal adaptation in like the 4 to 6 week study period. The longest studies in most cases that you see are like 20 weeks. Yes, there are certainly longer ones, but like for the bulk of the studies we turn to for evidence for these things, it's pretty short periods. And this is not a game where we're trying to maximize adaptations in short periods. This is a game where we're trying to maximize sustainable adaptations in the long term. And in that
Hmm.
situation, you cannot replace volume with intensity. And I think as we talk about this endurance training thing, like, yes, there's bottom up, there's top down. You can try different strategies, you can try different programs. But at the end of the day, when you're looking for physiological endurance adaptations, you really can't get around the fact that it comes down to
Time.
frequency and volume and being consistent with those things.
Yes. And not to shout out our blog again, but last May, I know that because I'm looking at the post right now. I did write about this similar concept, which is to say that like there's physiological ways of training and then there's more performance-based ways of training. And when I think about performance and having to hit a certain pace and race a thing or do, like that is traditionally more of an intensity conversation, whereas like you just mentioned, physiological adaptations, you cannot get around the fact that it takes time and requires volume and frequency. So, in as much as I think early CrossFit would try to convince you that you can just do a lot of hard stuff and that's going to serve you well on race day when you're at the marathon, come to find out that's not true at all.
Look at
And
every
now,
CrossFitter we've brought on the podcast.
yes, and it's interesting that now virtually all of those folks have transitioned more towards endurance type stuff because they recognize that it takes a long time to get good at it. So,
Sweet. Well, I'm going to turn your question around on you. Have we left any stones
have we
unturned?
left any stones unturned? I mean, this is, we could talk about this stuff forever. My assumption will be that this episode will generate questions, which would lead to further episodes or future blog posts. I know you and I have talked about this a lot. Like we love interviewing guests. We love talking about things like residuals around human performance, but we also know that a lot of people like to listen to us talk about how to actually train or how we think about training. So, disclaimer that I hope we've included in every single one of these episodes that we've done. If people out there want to learn more about a specific topic around training, reach out and let us know, and then we'll build an episode or a blog post around it. So, to
I'll
answer
do
your
something
question,
here.
I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of stones left unturned, but hopefully we can
Sure.
turn them over in an order that makes sense to our listeners.
Deal. I will do something here for the dedicated listeners who are still here at the end of the episode. I will put something out into the universe to hold Drew and I accountable because it's work that we have to finish doing. Drew said if you want to learn more about some stuff, let us know what it is so we can guide some of these 101 or more practical X's and O's episodes. Um, in the workshop, not ready for debut yet, but things we're working on. We're going to try and create some courses people can do if they want to learn a little bit more. And this might look like a few different things. I will probably hang some slides and some notes as a free download as like an example LPD people can go do for their units. That'll just be a free thing. You can take it and go use it. I think that'll add a little value. Um, Drew and I are going to work on like a slightly more structured course, hopefully with some like CEUs in it for coaches that are new to tactical. Again, we're going to try and make that something free. Costs a little bit to get it CEU approved, but I think we can take one for the team here and produce something of value for the coaching community on that side. So the first one's kind of for the military community, the second one's for the coaching community. And those are to kind of get us started on understanding what helps people, what looks right for a course, what the format needs to be, things like that. So if there's a course you wish existed or you wish we could put together, now's the time to let us know because we're starting to work on that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, just for example, how to program work capacity, how to program endurance, how to program strength, what is auto-regulation? I mean, that type of stuff.
And for the stuff I'm a nerd about, a guide to DoD policy on fitness
Yeah.
that people need to know.
What's the difference in a sergeant and a colonel? Maybe that'll be a quick one. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, well done. Let's throw that out there. Now people know. And enjoy your running.
Hopefully you're already running while you listen.
Hopefully you're already running. Have fun.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.